My name is Aaron Levere, and welcome to my podcast. I explore the deep reaches of space and time to talk to the people influencing or influenced by knives. In an effort to unpack the rich and complex culture and history surrounding edge tools and adjacent crafts, I jump off into the abyss to talk about all things knives with special guests all the time. Join me as we reminisce of the good old days on the Good Old Blades podcast. Arguably, R.W. Loveless is one of, if not the most influential knife maker and designer in the last century. Bob's designs are some of the most copied and reproduced in the market today, and you can see his impact on knife making in a majority of knives as well. Bob was an enigmatic man, as notable for his generosity as his tantrums, and those who knew him personally either loved, loathed, or did business out of love and trepidation. It's hard to decouple the man, the myth, and the legend of Bob Loveless from his personality, but I think that's why I needed to talk to John Denton about his long relationship with Bob, his dad, J.W. Denton's legacy in business, and John's personal history of collecting. With Bob passing away in 2010, John is the closest we get to the horse's mouth, as he and his father not only were close to Bob, but were the foremost collectors and dealers for his work. Today, John still deals in Loveless knives, and has handled probably more pieces of his shop's work than anyone on earth. John, what an honor it is to talk to you about you, your dad, and of course Bob, on the Good Old Blades podcast.
Aaron, thanks for having me on. I mean, it took a while for me to get hooked up on this. I was intimidated with the technology, but yeah, this would be great. Thank you for asking me.
Oh yeah, it's no problem. I often wonder sometimes if the way that I've decided to do this interview podcasting thing was a little bit complex. I've actually found that it's a little easier when I can walk people through it, and the format of the software that I use seems to be okay. So I mean, it really didn't seem to take you too much time to catch on to it. So.
Yeah, it was pretty. It was spooky. The sound of it was real spooky, but once it went through, I mean, this is more painless than what is it, FaceTime and all that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah,
That's really
yeah.
awkward. That's really awkward.
Yeah. Well, and I've actually really been surprised that some of the old timers in the knife industry have been able to get on and muddle their way through it too. So I'm really proud of anybody. If you can hop on this thing, then you're a technology guru as far as I'm concerned.
Good. We better quit before you go any further, because I'm sure I'll push the wrong button at any moment.
Well, for my listeners, I think the context at which I wanted to have you on here is that arguably you are the foremost expert on Bob Loveless and Bob Loveless knives. And in addition with that, you're a prolific collector and arguably, an artist in your own right. And I think that because we don't have the ability to talk to Bob Loveless, and we have some sound bites and mostly stories on the negative or positive side, that I thought it would be real great to talk to somebody who is as close to the horse's mouth as we could possibly get. And so, first I want to thank you for making the time. You've been somebody who I've wanted to have on the podcast for a long time. And it's really great to be able to finally coordinate and to have you here and talk about Bob and yourself.
Well, it's a good place to start, because I mean, there's collectors like me, whether it's paintings or knives, wristwatches, whatever it is, and you sort of want to go in depth with people that have seen certain things, ask certain questions. It'd be fun to talk to somebody that grew up next to Picasso, and they could say, well, this is what he was like, and this is what he really did, and this is how things worked. So that sort of history needs to be put down to where people can read about it, think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, context matters a lot, because I mean, I know I know Loveless through the context of other makers, especially. I have it in written text. But, we get into the personality issue in Knives where, people have bad things as well as good things to say about everybody. And we lose that context a lot of the times. If somebody writes something bad about a person or they write it good, it's it is what it is. Having somebody who's been so close and has been a large contributing factor to a maker's success and the investment that's required for that, to me, there's no better contextualization than that. So, kind of on that note, I want to, before we get into Bob's legacy and unpacking that, I really want to know more about you. Like, your earliest times in life where collecting or things like that was a thing, like how your life progressed to where it is today. So could you give me as long as you want to take on who is John Denton, and what got you to this place of intersection with Loveless?
That is a really interesting question, and it goes back probably 100,000 years of just, I don't know, hunter gatherers maybe, but there's people that collect, and then there's people that create. And somebody pointed out to me one time, because I collect a lot of paintings, and I said, why is this? What's the deal with collecting? They said, well, the thing is, the artist has to produce it, but also they've got to have somebody that appreciates it and buys it. So you're just an integral part of the wheel, just like the artist that creates it. And then you have the collectors that go out and buy the early Matisse, that go out and buy the early Salvador Dali when it comes out. So as a kid in the 60s, I grew up loving pottery. I collected pottery when I was 5 years old. I collected paintings. And I don't know where that comes from when you're in first grade and you want to be around art as much as a cigarette smoker has to be around a cigarette. So my whole life has always been leading toward, I guess, something like Loveless. And my father was the same way, and we just sort of fed off of each other, because he started racing sports cars in 1957 on the beach in Daytona with Bill France, the founder of NASCAR. He was driving a Jaguar XK 120, 1957, on the old track. And so the people we knew, the things that he saw, his ability to be a mechanic was something that through my life, he was always pointing things out to me. Look at the quality of this. Look at how this is done. Look at this, for example, a quilt. Think about what it took to do this. This is handmade. This is not, run through a sewing machine. So I was always very aware of the hand uh, involvement, and also the initial spark, because anybody can look at say a Salvador Dali painting and you go, that's great. You got a elephant and the feet are like swans and there's the necks are like giraffes. And once you see it, somebody can go out and reproduce it. They go, well, it's not that hard, but it's that original spark, and that's what Loveless had. He had that original spark when he was 23 years old and walked into Abercrombie and Fitch. I mean, there's not a whole lot of people. You see it in the music world, you see these bands that come out, whether it's Guns N' Roses or Eric Clapton, they just have this initial feed to the world that when they hit a chord, it's a chord that 20 million people like. In the same way with Loveless, his design, and my dad and I used to talk about this a lot, was the fact that Bob chose knives. He could have chosen anything and would have been a top designer. He could have chosen refrigerators. He could have chosen houses. He could have chosen cars, uh, pencil sharpeners, anything he wanted to design, he could have done it, but it just happened to be knives. So that is really kind of impressive that he, for some reason, and I think it goes back to his childhood when he was 10 years old. He said, I went hunting with my grandfather and a couple of his friends, deer hunting. And he said they shot a deer. And he said one of the old guys pulled out a 3-inch jackknife and just went to town on the deer. He said at 10 years old, he said that impressed me more than anything I had ever seen in my life. And I thought that's a pretty strong impression to have at 10 years old, to where you're impressed with somebody with a jackknife cutting up a deer. So that made it a lot easier to understand that when Bob walked into Abercrombie and Fitch, it wasn't just off the top of his head. He goes, "Oh, that's a knife. I can make it better." I think he already enjoyed knives the craftsmanship, what it meant for survival. So he comes from the creative side, and I come from the collector side. And so when they both meet, it's really pretty magical.
That's interesting. Do you only like it primarily collect knives? I know you mentioned about paintings, but what is the extent of your collecting, and what do you I mean, other than the technical side of I guess creation or manufacturing things, is there any other like uh, ideas or things that are evoked when you're collecting things? Like kind of what drives you to do that?
A lot of it has to do with history, with the item, how it ties back to something. Uh, Lately I've been buying a lot of Ferraris because we had Ferraris my whole life, and it just brings back memories of the '60s and the '70s when things were simple, and the cars, the 250 GTOs back then were $8 to $12,000 used, and now they're ringing around 40 million. So we understood what they were back then, but nobody was buying to collect for the future because those old things, you couldn't fix them, you couldn't get the parts from Italy. You basically took the engine out and put a Corvette engine to keep it running. So everything to me, if it has beauty, if it has uh, some sort of intrinsic value that doesn't necessarily have to be to me. If it's beautiful to me, it seems to be beautiful to a lot of other people. So I'm lucky that I have an eye for certain things, but I certainly have no creativity. I mean, I can't paint, I can't draw, but I appreciate people that can do it. So for me, that is a big kick just the experience. I mean, I've got about 1,000 pieces of artwork. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. And a lot of times it just stays on tour for 4 or 5 years to museums around the nation. And in a way, you miss having those pieces to look at. But then on the other side, somebody told me years ago, they said, as a collector, it's your duty to get these pieces out to where other people can enjoy them. And all of a sudden, that made a lot of sense to me. And I didn't really mind if they went out for 4 or 5 years. It's kind of like having a rock band. They would go out on tour, and then they come back home, and they go on another tour. So that's kind of my whole life is based around things that are really unusual, things that are really unique. And I also enjoy the chase. If somebody's looking for a rare 1975 turbo Porsche, which only 200 were made and none were sent to America, a guy in California was looking for one, and I had a blast finding him when I found one in Australia for him. And so to me, the chase and the education I get while looking for things is very, very intoxicating. I mean, last night I was up late looking at some Patek Philippe wristwatches, going back as to where does this fit in the history? How has it changed in the past 40 years? Um, so it's really interesting now that I'm old enough I could go back and revisit certain things that maybe I thought I really didn't like, or maybe I did like. But being a collector is pretty confusing. When people come to the house, they're pretty confused.
I can get that. I you know I, Kind of like on that note, I've been really interested in old style Rolls Royces, even though I don't have the money to buy them. But the fact that the wood paneling, this entire culture of wood paneling in like the rap community and Cadillacs and other things like that is all veneered, but then you had like real thick pieces of rare burls and other things that were fit into Rolls Royces, and the mechanics that went into all of that, and so early in this industrial revolution context, to me is a fascinating component. Like who decided to put all of those elements together and define what we consider as posh today.
I agree. I mean, the old Rolls Royces, the old Mercedes from the 30s and 40s. I mean, you just look at the wood in there, you look at the dials, you look at how they maybe engine turned the dials, how it was all sorts of very futuristic. And it was made in 1920. And you're like, man, that's 100 years old. And it still really looks beautiful. And at that point, Aaron, it becomes a work of art. You're like, I could just take that dash out and look at it. It's like a gun stock. There's some gun stocks that just absolutely, the wood is so beautiful, you really don't care what caliber the gun is. You don't care if it's a shotgun. You don't care what it is. But the beauty of the maple or the knives, you have the ironwood, you have all sorts of Purple Heart. Um, so yeah, just stuff like that can really make or break an item for a person.
Mm. So, in the concept of knives at the time, my understanding was that Bob's were a little bit on the pricey side, but that was that also the way that it was in the Abercrombie and Fitch catalog? Because my understanding was he was actually selling them fairly reasonably through Abercrombie and Fitch, correct?
Absolutely, they were $24 is what Abercrombie and Fitch priced them for. I talked to a doctor in Nashville, and he said I actually walked in 1954. He said I walked in Abercrombie and Fitch and bought a Loveless knife, and he was still using it. He was like 85 years old, but he would use it deer hunting and had been using it since 1954. So it was kind of amazing to hear somebody that actually walked in, saw it. It's like Elvis buying his first little guitar. Like, wow, that's kind of a big deal. So, yeah, there's people that walked in and bought them for $24. But they did say in the 60s, of course, the 70s, his knives were just outrageous, and you had to wait to get them. And they said once we got them, they were so beautiful, we didn't want to use them. So Bob kind of shot himself in the foot making a collector piece, but he said this is for the working man. And I'm like, Bob, the working man doesn't have $6,000 to use a knife. He goes, well, it's for the working man. It just burned him up. It's like, I don't make wall hangers. People should get out and use them. I'm like, Bob, they don't. They hang them up. So that was with him the whole period. They were always expensive. But also in my world of collecting over the past 60 years, I'd rather have 4 or 5 really, really great pieces than to have 30 run of the mill pieces.
Yeah. Now when it comes to your early collecting and everything, kind of going back to your history, my understanding is like you and your father had done collecting together. Was that something that he was also a collector, or kind of how did that dynamic work out with you and your father?
Yeah, I think he was a collector just as much as I was, maybe possibly more, but we both were definitely from the same foreign planet. We started out collecting, for example, Kimber rifles early on. A friend of ours, Greg Warren, and his father started this rifle company, these little 22s called Kimber rifles. So we bought 100 of those over a couple of years, and then we realized they're starting to stack up, they're starting to rust. There's so many of them, you can't get them out and look at them. So we sold all of those, every single one, and we started collecting Loveless knives. But the funny thing is, when we would go through a Blade magazine, we really didn't know anything about knives in general. But if there was one photograph, we'd look at it, we'd say, "Man, that knife really looks good." And you'd go look at the name, of course, it'd say Loveless. So it was just so weird that without really knowing visually, we were drawn to this certain knife. And the same story happened when this big collector died and left some Loveless knives and Jess Horn knives to the Smithsonian. And one of the knife dealers was up there and was going to help the lady pick out, what they should use. And he said, "I'll be right back." So while he was gone, she she picked out some knives for about 100 knives laying there. They were, like I say, Jess Horns, Buster Orinsky's, all these things, Ron Lake. And when he came in, she goes, "Oh, I've already picked out the knives." And he's just kind of, "Really? You picked out some knives?" And sure enough, she picked out 10 Loveless knives. And he said, "Why did you pick these out?" And she said, "Visually, these are so outstanding that you want to pick them up. You want to look at them." So to me, it just hit me. And that's what's so fun about when I do a show, especially when the women come through the shows and they totally look at a knife differently than a guy. They're not thinking about collecting. They're not thinking about investment. They're just looking at what looks good, and they'll pick up the Loveless knife. And it's just fascinating to know that happens to other people subconsciously. We like something. You hear a song on the radio, and you don't know really why you like it, but it just hits a lot of people. So same way with Loveless knives. They just, for some reason, they just draw that. I guess it goes back, if you look at Rolex watch, you see the Submariner. That's a perfect, when you think of a watch, you think of a Rolex, and you think of that design. Same way with Porsche 911. That's just an iconic car, and that's what you think of. And same way when you say the drop point hunter, Loveless just comes to mind. When you say the name Loveless, there's a knife that pops into your head. You could say uh, some other maker, and there's nobody's going to get a visual on it. So Bob was really in a unique situation with his knives. And AG told us after we sold those guns, we said, AG, who would you collect? And he said, Loveless, 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 and maybe somebody else. And we said, what's so great about Bob? He said, well, the thing is, Bob's up here on this planet, and down here are all the other knife makers. But he said, since he had been in business and since Bob had been in business, he said Loveless knives have gone up every single year. He said there's not another maker like that on the planet. So, AG and Bob had their ins and outs and had decades where they didn't talk to each other, and they finally patched it up. And even though they didn't get along, he still respected the knives. And that's where you have to separate the personality of Bob versus the product. Because if you take him as 100% of the product, he can be pretty hard to deal with. But the product itself is worth the hassle, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. Would you say, was there ever times when you were collecting Bob's work that the man was hard enough to deal with where you didn't want to collect, or was it always the product first and then you took Bob kind of as he was?
Oh yeah, it was 100% product. It's just like Formula One. Enzo Ferrari said you always pull for the car. You don't pull for the driver. He said drivers are a dime a dozen. It's the car. And same way with the Loveless knives. It was the Loveless knives. Bob's personality is going to come and go. Don't take it personal. But the knives are there's nothing else like them. You pick them up, the feel, the balance, the weight. That's the reason I like dealing with the Japanese people so much, the collectors. When they saw a Loveless knife, they would pick it up, feel of it, roll it around, and they'd hand it to their friend, and they'd say, look at this. Look how he changed the solder. Look how the guard is tilted a little bit. They caught all the little minute things that made it feel good. Whereas the American collector bought it because, oh, it's got a double nude on it, or this has got a certain handle, or basically because it's a Loveless knife and we've been told to buy it because it's a collectible. And that's what I don't want to harp on to people, that I mean, they have gone up, but as a collectible, you got to really like it. If you put them aside for a investment, it's just like anything else. It's not a lot of fun if you're just sitting there waiting for them to go up. You've got to have the love of the item you're collecting, because it may not always go up. So you got to be prepared for that. But with Loveless, he is really in a unique situation.
Yeah. So when you were collecting Loveless, had you ventured out into a lot of other knife makers, or kind of what was the scene at the
Oh,
time?
wow. We bought a knife from everybody we had read about in Knife Digest, everybody we read about in Blade Magazine. We bought Corbett Sigmund, we bought George Herring, we bought Durbin Howard, we bought Wayne Clay, we bought Bill Moran, we bought Ron Lake, Osborne, Loveless, Johnson's, everybody, Buster Warinsky. We bought knives from every single person out there. And when it kind of, after a while, you get a lot of knives. You're like, okay, it goes back to that theory of let's get 10 really great ones and sell the other 60. So that's what we started doing. We thought, okay, we'll sell these other. We'll come to find out the other pieces that we had didn't bring 50 cents on the dollar. They were really hard to sell. There was no collector market. Once we were hyped up because, hey, we knew the maker. Wow, it's fun. We read about him. Wow, Ray Beers had made a knife for the Pope. We're like, wow, his knives just certainly got to go up. I mean, he's made one for the Pope, uh, but it just doesn't work that way. So collecting versus investment, that's where it gets sticky. Investment wise, Loveless was brilliant, way above everybody else that we ever bought. Um, but other than that, we just enjoyed his knives and the look and the fit and the finish. Even though Bob always said, he said, you're going to catch your thumbnail somewhere on my knife. He goes, you want a perfect knife? Buy a factory knife. I'm a bench maker. But you go to Steve Johnson and you're not going to catch your finger nail on anything. It is so smooth. It is so everything's just put together like it's all one piece. But Bob's like, no, we went to the hardware, we bought nails, we put nails in there, we grind the head down, and send it out. So Bob was never about the fit and finish. So there's better quality makers, but for some reason his balance, his design, um, it's a huge gap, and a lot of people don't see it. They say, "Oh, we make a Loveless drop point hunter," and then you pick it up and you squeeze it, and it's really square. It really bites into the hand. The guard's too thick. The tang's not tapered enough. The handle's maybe more of a slab than it is sculpted. So it can look like it in photographs. You see knives that look really, really great, but when you pick them up in real life, you're like, man, this thing is a dog. It's just like that Loveless that went for like $180,000. It was the Delaware, had the big buoy with all the engraving on it. Um, we bought that when we bought the Al Williams collection, and that knife was in there. And before we actually saw the knife, we thought that's the greatest knife in the world. But when we got it, out of the 300 knives, it was the least favorite knife because it was heavy, it was clunky, it photographed beautifully, but when you picked it up, it was a door. I mean, you could just it was an anchor basically. It was real disappointing. It didn't feel like Loveless. So that's one of the first knives we sold. We just didn't like it.
That's interesting to me. When it comes to, I guess what I'm thinking about is, going back to when Loveless got started. My understanding is with Abercrombie and Fitch, his motivation was competing with Bo Randall, which at the time he had a large following because of all of his not knife work during World War II. Was there a lot of competitive nature between Randall knives and Loveless knives inside of Abercrombie and Fitch, and kind of what was the dynamic between those two makers early on?
No, it was never really any rift in there, because Bob was making what he saw as his knives, and Bo was making the knives that he needed to make. So they were really two different makers, but they were both in the same market, if that makes any sense to you. The fact that Loveless, and he always said, if you come out to my shop, he says, I'll show you how to make a knife. If you're having problems with a handle, I'll show you how to do it. And if you can make a better knife than me, by all means, please go make it. So Bob, if you approached him on the knife making side, was way, way, way more giving, more friendly, would help you out on anything you needed. So he was very open. He's like, anything I design, you can have a pattern of it. Please try to make one better than I do, because he says I make what I make.
I'm interested to know, and because I don't know if you have this context, but between makers, there are a few makers who went out and got patterns made by Bob, or they were scribing things or whatever. But the Loveless pattern is pretty coveted amongst makers. So I know that there's some like gatekeepers out there that won't give any of the patterns that they originally received from Bob, even like copies or whatever. Are you yeah? Are you aware of that kind of like subculture within knife making, that people kind of like guard and don't share Loveless patterns too much if they got them directly from him?
Yeah, I do. I'm a little bit aware of that, and I'm kind of shocked because I always encourage makers from around the world whenever they come to the table, they say, I've never seen a Loveless, I've never held a Loveless. I'm like, pick it up, feel it. And you can see the light bulb going off in their hand. And I say, come back and trace this pattern, trace it, go home, try to make it, now that you know what one feels like. So it's very important that you have that as original as you can, because I don't know the reason, because Bob never did that. Bob always gave you his pattern. He's like, here's my design, do it. So why people hold it back, I really don't know, because I don't think people can make. It's like just saying a Stradivarius. It's like, oh, you may you may have the paperwork on how to make it, but can you make it? Can you make it sound? No, you can't. You can't get that sound out of it. The same way with Bob, there's so many subtle things about it. I mean, we've owned over we've owned over 3,000 Loveless knives. I have felt a lot of knives, and it is so obscure and finite that even some of the best makers in the world miss the simple things that make the Loveless click. When you pick up their knife, it's really, really close. You're like, that's really a good knife, but it's off. So I don't think holding the pattern back is going to help anybody's career.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. When it comes to the Loveless shop and then other makers like Merritt and Johnson and them coming in, like what's the general appeal for knives based on the era that makers were, in helping them with this work? I mean, do you have a specific era of Loveless that you prefer over others, or knives that you see that are, I guess, more collectible during a certain period of time?
Yeah, there was a certain period of years to where it seems like everything he did was magical. And that was from about 70 to 78 through the 80s into the 90s. There's always great period pieces to pull out of there to where you can see that little gerbil that was running around in his head was really working overtime. You're like, wow, this is a great design. And it'll be like 1992 and he comes up with a design that's like, wow, wow, you didn't make that back in the 60s. But really, the thing that rips everybody up is the Loveless Johnson logo. I mean, that is just that's the magical period. That's Camelot right there. You got a Loveless Johnson logo, so you got the best fit and finish man with the greatest knife designer on the planet. It's like having Porsche and Ferrari make a car for you, or Matisse and Picasso. It's working together. So you've got two you got two giants working there. So the Loveless Johnson, without a doubt, is just a magical period because there's less than maybe 40 or 50 knives that are stamped that. So it also goes back to legend. It also goes back to a simpler time. It goes back to where Steve was the very first helper that Loveless had. But in 1971, when Steve came, Bob was really not by himself anymore. Um, Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, he had Jim Merritt in the early 80s. He had Kuzan Oda with him in the 70s. So he always had somebody, in the shop. And I asked him one time, I said, what'd you do in the late 70s? He said, I didn't make any knives for 2 years. And I'm like, really? What'd you do? He said, I laid around drunk. I was just taking royalty checks from Gerber because Gerber had taken his design. And I said, you didn't make any knives? He goes, oh, I might have made 4 or 5. He goes, I just didn't make anything. So the periods of Lawndale, he's definitely in the shop by himself. He's got wide tang. He's got weird looking knives. I remember being at Al Williams' house, and Al had 150 Loveless knives out there. And Bob walked in the door and he goes, well, that's 50 years of mistakes right there. I was like, well, Bob, most people don't have their mistakes copied. And Bob's like, he's like, I would pay you not to ever show that knife to anybody because it was an ugly knife in Lawndale. I mean, it was a big, thick handle. It was just embarrassingly ugly. And Bob was quite aware of it. And he said, I just hate for a knife like that to be seen. So he had some, not everything was a home run for him. That's for sure. He experimented always.
I'm interested to know a little bit more context wise, because you've seen the Loveless market holistically. But then there's also a lot of makers now that reproduce Loveless patterns. And I know that we talked a little bit about you're like the look and the feel and the provenance of Loveless is not really always matched in makers. Do you see as much collectability in Loveless reproductions today? Because it seems to me like you either make a unique design or something that's inspired, or you're really trying to reproduce an authentic Loveless pattern. And I'm wondering, kind of like from somebody who has collected the man, how you feel about the market holistically in trying to replicate his previous works.
The market, it seems like you're correct. I mean, everybody wants to make a Loveless drop point hunter, and that's what years ago people told me. They said, when we started making knives, we got the book How to Make Knives, and we all wanted to make a Loveless drop point. even people in Italy, Germany, Japan, South Africa, they're like, we wanted to make the Loveless drop point. So yeah, they all wanted a copy. And I asked a couple of the top makers a few years ago, I said, now that you've proven you can make a really good copy of a Loveless knife, how do you break out of that shadow? And they said, we don't know. So how do you reinvent? How do you make something better than the Rolex Submariner? How do you make a standard utilitarian thing any better? I mean, you can start adding diamonds and emeralds and doing inlay and weird blade shapes, and then you lose the functionality of the blade. So how do you make such a and that's what the Japanese like about their pottery. Some of their thousand-year-old pottery that's been broken, it's been repaired with gold, and that's a sign. That's a great sign that it's been repaired. That they take into account the age of it and how it was made. But with Loveless, it's hard to go in your own direction. I mean, Corbett Sigmund had his own knife style. I mean, he certainly tried to step outside of Loveless, but it just didn't work. I mean, nobody really knows who Corbett Sigmund is anymore. But that is tough. That is a tough one. And there's great makers out there that make a really great quality knife that because with Loveless you're going to pay 5 or 6 thousand for a drop point hunter. So are there knife makers that can make a really good drop point hunter for 800? That's a fact. 1,500, sure. 400, absolutely. So there's decent knives, but not everybody's going to be collectible. Not everybody can be Rembrandt. There's a lot of people that can paint like Picasso, but Picasso already held the market. The original spark was there. So it's tough. I don't know how they do it.
Well, I think that something I think about, and I'd love to know from you, is um, you've had this era of collecting and handling a lot of Loveless knives. Do you actively collect other makers' knives today? Is there people that you like track? Like how do you fit today in a world where you had previously collected a lot of Loveless, but like what are you doing today, and what do you keep an eye on when it comes to knives?
Over the decades, we've pretty well just thinned down to Loveless only because it was so complicated to keep up with the Ron Lake market, the Jess Horn's market. So in a way, we took the easy way out. We took the top men in the field, Loveless, and that's like picking Ferrari. It's like, okay, that's all I'm going to sell. I'm going to sell only Ferraris. I'm going to be an expert in Ferrari. I don't care what Mercedes does. I don't care what Bentley does. I don't care what Pagani puts out. You're not in competition with those. So I don't collect anything else other than Loveless. The only thing I still have would be some Loveless. I mean, some Steve Johnson knives. But I just really, if I really like a knife, I'll buy it and use it or something like that. But as far as collecting to the point to where I really enjoy having it, I've realized over the years that bulk doesn't really satisfy me. So I'm really at this point after so many decades, you come to the point where you feel comfortable with your choices and you know what's going to make you happy, what's going to make you happy, what's going to make you unhappy. So you just don't let yourself go into those places. And that's collecting across the board, whether I'm buying a car or a wristwatch, it's got to fit somewhere for me to want it. And with Loveless, that's kind of because he hits me on all sides. The financial side is fun, the collecting side is fun, the artistic side is really great. So he checks a lot of boxes for me personally.
Something that I've been thinking about a lot, the Knife Makers Guild is something that I've gotten more immersed in over time. And, like Bob being a pioneer of the guild and whatnot, I've come to appreciate the, like the business or guild side of his life, right? But one problem that knife making seems to have today is that there's not as many collectors of really good handmade knives, it seems like that the renaissance of collecting has changed a lot to more of like a consumer based, sub $800 type of world. And I'm interested to know from somebody who had collected and who started out, kind of endearing themselves to knives. How do we get more collectors like you were back then into the industry? Is it something that we just make and then expect people to collect it, or do you think that there's a larger, fiduciary duty, as it were, for knife makers and organizations like the Guild and whatnot to foster collecting and nurturing the education component of it?
The guild was really really strong, and it really pushed knives to a whole different level. Unfortunately, we don't have that sort of mechanism in place anymore. The whole landscape has changed in knife collecting, how knives are made, whether they're tactical and they're semi-factory, semi-hand assembled, or they're all factory. It's totally changed from the way they're made, the financials, the age group. As far as making a handmade knife and making a living at it, Bob said years ago, he goes, well, I hope you enjoy starving. Once somebody would say, Bob, I just became a full-time maker. He's like, well, I hope you enjoy starving. And that's still kind of the same way today. I don't know how you would go in and compete. I mean, you think about it, who right now can really compete with, say, McLaren, Ferrari, Porsche, and Lamborghini? Is there those guys already have their seat at the table? So how do you outdo that? In the same way with Loveless, he already has a seat at the table. Ron Lake, great folder maker, he's already the top of that heap. And one thing AG did say years ago, he said, there's Loveless and there's all these other makers. He said, but the thing is, there's room for all these other makers. There's room for Jess Horn, Steve Johnson, uh, Jim Schmidt, all these people. So it's. I would be scared to be a knife maker because I don't know how you would. I don't know how you would get seen. I don't know how you would promote your work. I don't know how you would get people excited to buy your knife versus somebody else's knife. Maybe it's best value if you got a $450 knife that feels really really great. Maybe you can sell the daylights out of it. But as far as collectability, I don't know. Years ago we tried to find the next Loveless. I mean, even 40 years ago, we're like, okay, we got Bob. We know what he's doing. So we thought we could bring these other people up to Loveless level, and we tried really hard for several years with a lot of different makers. It just didn't work out. I mean, it just really did not work out. So it's it's tough to be a maker in today's world. That the Then something Steve Johnson told me. He said, these kids that are coming out now, the first year of knife making, he said, they're making better knives than I made after, working years doing it because of materials, the information that's out there, the machinery available. You can just start out making a much better product now, but there's a better product sale. I mean, how exciting is a Lexus? It's better than a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, but is a Toyota going to bring 35 million? It's really not. So it's just the collecting world is such a weird. It's an odd one. You can't really pick it. I think the stock market is more predictable, and they always say if you throw a dart at the stock market, you're going to beat what all the analysts say. So in the knife world, I really don't know how you pick the next person.
Yeah, I've also often wondered that too. I mean, as a knife maker myself, it's a really weird industry to navigate because in standard business, things are pretty predictable. It has a lot to do with visibility. It has to do with a good value proposition. But as you get into crafts, I can make the most unique looking knife in the world, and there'd be nobody there to buy it. And the juxtaposition or weight of a maker is that it's really hard to make things if you don't have somebody there to buy things. and you need to be able to pay for the process of creativity, right? And so that's a large dilemma that I think we're in, where I wouldn't know either. There's some knife makers that sell better than others. There's some that they're working off a slim margin, and they do it because of pure passion. Kind of what I've tried to propagate is that I'm really not interested in looking at Loveless reproductions too much, although I know that lots of people still like it or pay homage to him. I'm really want to be able to see in the industry more unique um, takes on knives, and to see people doing their own things, and at least spitballing design principles and whatnot, rather than just trying to ride on the coattails of Loveless or some of these other great makers. But I'm just as guilty as it is anybody. I see a great pattern, I'm like, I want to make that thing, and then I chase that into, I don't know, maybe a corner or not. I'm just interested to know if there is any secret sauce. But from your indications, it seems like you kind of just you hit it. It's kind of like viral videos on the internet today.
Yeah, we didn't find any you know takers for the Loveless for that level, and we certainly looked, and they still could be out there. And also a maker can make a really really great knife, but it's sort of like Dervin Howard. I mean, the guy took 6 months to make a switchblade, probably one of the best switchblade makers in the world, but nobody really knew who he was. And when he went with Barrett Smythe, uh, his knives went up, and then he just dropped off the planet. So you've got people that have had, like Wally Hayes in the 70s. Good golly, his knives were so far advanced in the folder market. It was just crazy. Royal Hansen was just, his fit and finish in the 70s was just magnificent. But these people today, you can't hardly give them away. So it's if the quality is there, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a winner. And a lot of people do it as a hobby. You know, Bob didn't go full time maker until 1969. So a lot of people kept their regular day jobs and made these as Jim Schmidt was a teacher, made a great knife, made 12 knives a year, um, but still just kept a regular day job, kept insurance, all that sort of stuff. So reality sets in.
Yeah, I kind of want to I kind of want to segue into talking a little bit about Bob, the man, the myth, the legend, right? Because I think like talking about his knives um, is one thing, but talking about Bob the person is another complex nut to crack, right? And contextually, I've heard from some knife makers that they were like, I don't bring my wife to knife shows, back in the day, because Bob had a mouth on him, and and ruffle the feathers of the housewives and stuff of other makers, or things like that, right? That there's a culture inside of knives, and especially something that Bob had, he was a larger than life character in the way that he conducted himself. And I kind of just want to dig a little bit more into your knowledge about Bob from his early childhood and everything up to when he passed, like, and just kind of segment out his life and how you intersected with that.
Yeah, Bob as a person was very much hidden, sort of like the Wizard of Oz. He hid behind this big, huge curtain, and he was larger than life. And he'd go to the gun shows, and he'd come in hung over, and he'd have his 45 on the table, and he just presented himself as an outlaw sort of thing. And the Japanese seemed to really, like that. And it seems the more Bob pushed and the tougher he was, the more people were, excited about him. Uh, I just remember being at the shop, and I'd always try to, unwind his head, get him out of the knife rope, because Bob tends to go on very deep subjects. He's one of the most well-read people I've ever run into in my life. And so he always had a conversation that he dictated. So I would always try to get him to reverse and go into something maybe he's not comfortable with, and that was, growing up. And he said, I said, what about your grandparents? What, I said, did you sit around and talk to them about who their parents were and where they came from? And his answer was, no, we were too busy making a living. I'm thinking, you obviously at 9 years old, you really didn't care to ask your grandparents about it because you were obviously just living and trying to be a kid. But his answer was just no, we didn't have time. Like he was so busy, like no, we didn't have time to think about fun stuff. And maybe that was the way his early life was. It certainly doesn't sound like a fairy tale by a long shot. And I think that developed a lot of his personality and a lot of his you know he let them see the worst side of him sometimes to test to see if they were still there after. Some were and some weren't. So it was he was some days he was really really great, and some days I've heard him pick up the phone and just absolutely cuss people out. And I said, Bob, who was that? And he goes, I don't know. So I was just like, wow, you just rip into somebody on the phone. So you never knew what was going to set him off. Uh, but I talked to his daughter last year, and she was really interesting because I said, "What was it like having Bob as a dad?" I said, "We all know him as a knife maker. We all know the Loveless knife, but we don't know what it was like eating dinner with him. We don't know what it was like riding in the car, going on vacation." She just said, "I remember going out to my dad's shop, in Lawndale in the '60s." And he'd look at a blade and said, I remember my dad, if the blade wasn't right, he'd bounce it off the ground, see if it snapped, see if it broke, and, he'd throw it all over the room. And I keep trying to get Steve Shackelford to write a story from Bob's daughter on the human side of Loveless, because nobody knows what she knows. Even I don't know, because Bob wouldn't talk. If you talked to Bob, you wouldn't know he had three daughters. You have no idea he even has any family. You think, well, he was just, some honey badgers brought him up. So I really would like for his daughter to do an article in Blade magazine. She could say, this is what we did. This is how Daddy handled certain situations. This is what we did for supper. Some of that, because that really is a total mystery. It's like the bottom of the ocean. We don't know much about it.
Yeah, I didn't know that about him either. That I mean, I knew that he had been married and everything, but you know, I mean, I think that would be um, a fascinating journey in humanizing somebody who is legendary now. But I also wonder, like Steve Johnson, he is a Latter Day Saint and everything. There's a lot of preoccupations with LDS and human conduct, and I always wondered like how easy it was to get along with somebody like Bob in the context of a a really pragmatic religious worldview and everything. And everything I've heard about with Steve Johnson is that he just loved the man and respected him and everything. Now, I mean, I'm sure that some of that is I don't really want to speak ill of people or the dead, but then I also wonder, for the years that they were together, there was some redeeming qualities to Bob that he had to be able to endure, and other people did in the shop. John Wilson, worked with him as the last apprentice in the Loveless shop, and I'm kind of interested to know about their perspectives on how easy it was to deal with the man too.
That's a funny thing. I asked Steve. What was it like with Bob back then? I mean, you think here's this nice normal kid that's just smart and intelligent, and there's Bob rough on both sides and cussing like a sailor. I said, how did y'all get along? And Steve said, we both enjoyed shooting. I was like, really? He said, yeah, we both really enjoyed shooting. And back then, Bob was absolutely burning the candle on both ends. He used to tell me stories about him and David Crosby. when David would come to the shop, or he said a lot of days they'd take David's sailboat out, and it was just absolute uh, debauchery. I mean, I'm like, Bob, how did you make it? He's like, I don't know. He said, I tried to burn the candle on both ends as hard as I could. He said, I went out with David Crosby one night. Said went to some sort of fundraiser. The next day, David comes in. He goes, Bob, do you remember? Did I write a check for $20,000? Bob said, Yep, sure did. And he said you could write 5 more just like it. And he's like, Oh heck. So Bob um, and Steve, I mean, that was he would have been with Bob when that was in fire and brimstone period. I mean, Bob didn't calm down really until after the year 2000. So in the 70s, and I think that's the reason uh, he really didn't like John Lennon. I'm trying to think why. Bob said John Lennon's the most overrated musician on the planet. Like, really? He goes, yeah. He and this little Japanese girl came to the shop and stayed all day. He said the guy was just complete. Uh, he didn't have anything in common, and it hit me. I thought, well, there's, John Lennon that's love and peace and long hair, and there's Bob who looks like Sergeant Carter with a crew cut on, and he's either black or white this way or the other. There's no in between. There's no give and take. So I don't imagine that the peace signs with John Lennon and the Loveless philosophy would match. And then it hit me that the little Japanese lady with him was not Yoko. So that would have been the connection would have come properly through David Crosby in L.A. when John Lennon had the break from Yoko, and they spent that 2 or 3 weeks in L.A. that everybody talks about. But he was out there with some other Japanese woman, and I would assume that was when he went to the Loveless shop. And I think the only way he would have known the Loveless shop is through David Crosby.
That's that's pretty fascinating. I didn't know that John Lennon had been out there at all. I'm not sure. Has that been written about at all? I mean, because that's absolute news to me.
I may have mentioned it through some articles or something like that, but Bob said he did talk to Paul McCartney on the phone. He said, now, Paul is brilliant. And I'm thinking, well, how did you know he's brilliant by talking to him on the phone? And John Lennon is the most overrated musician in the world. And the funny thing is, Bob played the harmonica. And according to Al Williams, he said he's the most wicked harmonica player you have ever heard in your life. And Bob told me, he said, David Crosby's always trying to get me to come record, with him, do some stuff, but he never did. But Bob played the harmonica, obviously really, really good.
Yeah. Do you wonder if like what I guess we talk about uh people of Bob's caliber, and I guess he seems to be somebody who's like genius level, like in the way that he thought about things. Yeah, maybe a little rough and tumble in his behavior, but the way that he thought about things and the talent that he had for just being a Renaissance man makes me really think that maybe he was just on a different level of thought, and how he I guess how he perceived the world.
Yeah, his brain power was intimidating. He really was one of the most intimidating people you'll be around, just because of his not only his bluster but his pure lockdown knowledge of what I mean. If he's talking about a soybean crop in South America, he knows how many liters per hectare that they need to put on it to make it grow. I mean, the guy went in depth on everything, and he really was a complete genius. Didn't mean he had a lot of common sense. He didn't pay off his house until the 1990s. He'd been renting the house and paying on it since 1974. And my dad's like, "What? Bob, you've never paid your house off?" And Bob's like, "No." So we started getting Loveless on a schedule to where he finally paid off his house. He'd call us up when he bought a truck, and he'd say, "Oh, I need $30,000." We'd say, "What'd you buy, Bob?" He goes, "Well, I just bought a new truck. I need 30,000." So back then we would send him, 30,000 cash in the mail, if you can believe that. And we'd put rocks in it to give it some weight. But Loveless kind of used us as a bank, and then he would eventually send us knives. We were getting about 60 to 70 knives a year out of the shop when nobody else could get them, and plus nobody in America wanted them. So we just said, well, Bob will take everything you want. Bob's like, no, no, no. I still like to think I've got collectors out there. So when he tried to do the cheap knife in the '80s, he tried to do a little thing called a half tang because knife sales were down, his fame was down, and he said, I'm going to make a $350 knife. And I remember George Herron said, I'm going to do the same thing. Several in Corbett Sigmund, several other makers were talking about, we're going to make a cheaper knife, make it more affordable. And my dad said, Bob, don't do that. Don't make a cheaper knife. You're already established up here at this level. Don't cheapen your product. Don't cheapen yourself. Don't make a cheap knife. Keep going with your integrity. But he did make about 25 of these little half tangs, and they're really beautiful. Some of them are very ugly, but when you feel of them, they're really great. They're really magical. But it just shows you there was a time where I was trying to figure out how to make a $350 knife that would sell.
So, kind of on that note, I do want to talk a little bit about the slump and how that ended up working out. So, you said that he was having a hard time selling his own knives. Do you think that you and your father's investment is what carried him through that duration, or was there any set of like things that stacked up to eventually bring him through that period of, I guess, economic downturn or popularity downturn?
I would say during those 15 years when we first stepped in, that we had a huge, we were basically his market. He didn't know that. And we would have other people call in to him and order knives. So Bob thought he was selling to some different dealers. He thought he was selling to different collectors because he wouldn't sell everything to us. And so he said, I've got orders coming in from these. So these people would turn around and send those knives directly to us. So he didn't know that we were being fed by his collectors here in America because there were no collectors here in America. And the people in California, Paul Bash and those guys, they said, we were talking about you and your dad. We're like, either y'all are the smartest people on the planet or you either the dumbest people on the planet, and maybe you know something that we don't know, because they said, we can't figure out why you're buying Loveless knife. I mean, every single knife, Aaron, that came up for sale, we bought. We bought it if it came from Loveless, if it came from AG, whoever had it, we bought Loveless knives, and we took them to shows because at that point, Bob didn't do shows for about 20 years because he was so backlogged. It was embarrassing for him to show up because people would say, hey, I ordered a big bear. I paid you $600. I want my big bear. And the big bear was selling for like 5,000. Bob's like, I don't have your knife. So about 20 years, he didn't go to knife shows. So we went to knife shows all over America that Bob would have never, ever gone to. And we introduced his knives back into the U.S. market because back then the people we could sell to was the Japanese. We just sold. The Japanese would take everything we could make and everything that Bob could make, and that was where the market was. But we were his secondary market for about 20 years. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he would have gone a whole different route had we not stepped in.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I don't it's hard to kind of unpack that because I don't know of anybody today that would bankroll an artist like that. But I am reminded that Frank Lloyd Wright, famous architect and everything, would kind of had the same semblance where his all of his houses were over budget. People were waiting a long time to see what he came up with. He was kind of cantankerous in his design principles and built in a lot of fixtures that you couldn't remove because he didn't want anybody to change his grand vision. And he was bankrolled by the people who wanted his architecture in their houses, so they just kind of dealt with it and gave him an egregious amount of money for it. Did you guys ever have like any ill will, or was there any resentment harbored towards Bob because of that entire interaction, or did you guys just know that you were in it for the long haul and just kind of dug into that integrity that you guys had?
we, we knew enough about Bob's personality to not get on the wrong side of it. The funny thing is, good golly, and I've never seen anything like it, but he and my father never, ever over the decades had a cross word. I mean, he respected J.W. Denton. I mean, whatever J.W. Denton said, Bob never popped back at him. He never snapped at him. It was just amazing. Everybody else you talked to, they had falling out. Bob would do this, and they'd try to come back and fight with him, and it just always turned up in a horror show. But there was total respect on both sides because my dad was absolute genius, and I felt like every day I talked to him, I was in a Harvard graduate school. I mean, the things I learned were just the way he handled people, the way he did business, the way he handled people around the world, through the race car world, all the people that we met, my whole life. I was just so amazed. I'm like, wow, how do you do that? How do you know this? How do you assume? How do you read people basically? And so he and Loveless never had a single problem. I mean, one time we sent Bob a knife out. Bob called and said, JW, send me a knife out. It's a little half tang. It's in the Al Williams book. He said, I want to make one for me and Jim. So, like idiots, we sent him the knife out. And about 4 months later, we saw that same knife on eBay. And we're like, we just sent that to Bob. So we called the guy on eBay. We're like, where did you get this knife? He goes, yeah, I was just down at Bob's shop and he had this thing for sale and I bought it from him. We're like, wow, that's pretty neat. So we ended up buying the knife back from the guy on eBay. We never told Bob about it because if you confronted Bob about it, you would never get any more knives. So why cut off the golden goose? We were getting 60 knives a year from the guy. So if he sold a knife out from under us, we're like, that's just the way of dealing with Bob. So pretty soon you learned not to send him knives out to look at. You'd send him stuff and it would just vanish around the shop. I remember I brought back some scales, some rose petal handles. So they were compressed rose petals made into these handles. And I brought them back to Bob's shop when I got back from Tokyo. And he said, he goes, oh, so that's the rose handles that I've been, because the Japanese would never send him the rose petal handle stuff. And he said, so that's what it's like. He goes, John, I'll tell you what. He goes, I'll put this on a smart little knife for you and it'll look great. I never saw that knife. Where did those handles go? Somebody else did it. I remember in 1992, we went to the Blade or Guild show in Orlando. So we take Bob around. He's going to make some knives for us, some big bears. So we end up buying him $3,000 worth of really great sheep horn and mastodon. And we get to the New York show, and all these dealers, all these people have these sheep horn knives and all this mastodon. We're like, where did you get this stuff? And they said, oh, Bob called us up and said he had some sheep horn knives. So we got 2 knives out of all that sheep horn. So that's just the way Bob did business. We used to trade him IWC wristwatches for big bears because we had a friend that could get IWC wristwatches at 50% off. So if the watch was listed for 6,000, we had 3,000 in it. So Bob would want 6,000 for a big bear. And we'd say, Bob, we will trade you this IWC for the big bear. He's like, that's great. So the other side of that is when he took a watch or something like that, his partner, Jim Merritt, didn't get any piece of the action. So Bob, he always had a different view about finances and sharing what's shared. So it was he was tricky to deal with. He was always tricky.
Yeah, that seems like a complex relationship to navigate. I mean, even in the context of you telling me this, I don't know that there would be a lot of people around that would tolerate that today. The reputation of makers and stuff, you can hardly have an argument with other makers online or on Facebook or anything like that without collectors saying, nah, I'm not interested in a maker who's going to cause such a kerfluffle or whatever. It's insane to me to imagine that the unorthodox and questionable business practices of Loveless, and then that you guys would have tolerated that so long. But I guess what I'm interested in is, I would assume, based on kind of like the wheeling and dealing with Bob, that you guys still ended up being able to come out ahead on the dealings holistically, right?
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, we were making we were making hundreds of thousands of dollars. We were making more by selling Loveless knives than Bob was making the knives. I mean, it was a gravy train for a while. It was just insane. So we're like, why kill the golden goose? It's just too, it doesn't make any financial sense at this point to do it, and there's no reason, even though he was painful to deal with. Where's the next game in town? Who does that? Like I say, you and I, if we acted like that, we'd never sell another knife. But Bob said, if you want the knife, take it. If you don't, I've got 20 other men that'll take it. And he was just flat across the board. He's like, you don't want it? I can sell it to 20 different people. What are you going to do? So, you either put up or shut up.
Yeah, and do you think that that was true? Did he have a lot of people that were lined up to take that out from under you if you guys didn't want to deal with him?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. He definitely had people to sell to at that point.
Yeah. I'd like to, if you're okay with it, dig in a little bit more about your father, because where I sit, you guys obviously had money to play, and to collect and to kind of do all this stuff, and you mentioned about your father, and and your education and business and things like that. I really don't know a lot about your father, and I was wondering if you could give me, like a brief history on him, kind of like what set him apart, and what was like, how did he get to a point where he could do stuff like this, where with collecting and investing and whatnot.
JW, which is my father, I mean, books could be written about that guy. It's unbelievable. Born in rural Appalachia, Hiawassee, Georgia, population 420 people, 1930, the year after the Depression. There's nothing but farmers up here. Nobody's got any money. I mean, it was just farmland and dirt, and it just a very hard life. I said, "What's the greatest thing you've seen since you've been alive?" He said, "The indoor plumbing." He's like, "Without a doubt, indoor plumbing was the greatest invention in my life." So he grew up. He was really a brilliant, brilliant person. Uh, I mean, I could just go on and on about the things that he did as chairman of the hospital and chairman of the school board and chairman of the Georgia Mountain Fair, and how it became one of the top 100 attractions in the United States. Everything he did was on a global scale. His mind was so far-reaching. He could foresee 20 years down the road about things. And one of the first people he ever put into politics back in the '60s was a guy named Zell Miller, who later became governor of Georgia and senator. And Zell lived right here in Towns County, taught at a little bitty school called Young Harris College. And my dad said, "Okay, you're well educated. You don't know what you want to do, Zell, but you can debate really great. And you've got some good ideas." He said, "We're going to run you for the legislator in Georgia." This was like 1963 or 1964. So JW he had a vision for people and what they could do, and he had a vision for what the town needed. He had visions for the way things could grow. And it rubbed people the wrong way because they just didn't see it. They're like, "JW, you're crazy." They're like, "There's nobody going to be moving to the mountains. There's nothing up here. We don't need a bigger school." Well, sure enough, we've got more people up here, and the little local college, which he and Zell Miller tried to get a road going around in 1977. They tried to do a bypass around this little college town, and the college professors were like, "No, no, no, you're not going to build a bypass around us because that'll bring people up here, and you're not going to do it. We don't want anybody to find us. We love it. It's so quiet." And JW said, "What you don't understand is if it's a pig trail, people are still going to come to the mountains." And this was before the mountains got really popular in the '90s. And right now, as we speak, they're tearing out a multi-billion-dollar bypass around Young Harris, around that little college town. They had been begging for the bypass. There's so much traffic. There's so many semi trailers, but that's how clear it was to my dad back in the '70s, and it just goes on and on. I mean, when he was racing cars, he's like, I knew I had to either become a mechanic myself or quit racing. So one winter, he took a little Fiat, took the whole engine apart, laid it all out, everything on the floor, and rebuilt it. So his brain power was just absolutely spectacular. And I still get emails from people in Italy, Japan, and Tokyo talking about, your dad told us this, and this is what your dad, this is how he helped us with this. And it's just, I'm still blown away with his knowledge. I'm still like, how do you know how to do that? Where does all that knowledge come from? So he was very unique, and the people that met him realized he was very unique.
Did he grow up that way with like an aptitude? I mean, what was his, experience in school and things like that like?
Oh gosh, he said by the first 6 weeks of school, he would already go through his entire algebra book and do every single problem in there. His brain was just, it was off the chart. I mean, he could see things in almost, people could see things in 3D. Well, he could see things in 4D. He could look at a engine like in a race car. He was walking around the track and he saw this race car, and he looked at the transmission, he looked at the gear shift, and he's going through his head, he's thinking about this, and the cogs are spinning there, and cigarettes smoking, and he's like, He goes, if we turn this thing upside down, put it in, it will fit in our race car. The gears, instead of going from 1, 2, 3, 4 from left to right, well, I'll be far right will be first, second, third, fourth will be over to the far left. But he totally put the thing upside down in his brain, saw how it would fit, how it would work, and already he would tell the people building his car. He'd say, "This is what I need." He would explain to them, and then they had the ability to build what he saw, and that's the reason he really liked people like Durbin Howard. He could give Durbin. He could say, Durbin, we need a knife that's going to do this. It's going to have a different pivot point. It's going to have a different spring. It's going to be different loaded. And sure enough, Durbin knew how to build it. And Durbin ended up getting patents off these A-bar knives because of the locking mechanisms on them. So he was always way, way above anything I could ever. And the thing is, like in his hometown, I mean, his parents didn't do any of that stuff. It wasn't like it was handed down. He was the only one in the family that knew how to crank the car. He said when he was 10 years old, his dad couldn't get the car cranked. He'd be like, "JW, come get the car cranked." And he'd go out and crank it.
Hmm. It's fascinating. I mean, what do you feel like what you retained from that? I mean, the most like valuable components of it, because I know that you talked about like how to deal with people, but what has followed you throughout your life and your accomplishments from that experience holistically? Just his overall intelligence, or just the vast amount of experience that he gave you, and just like this really multifaceted approach to seeing genius.
The biggest thing is always do what is right. No matter how bad it hurts, you've got to do what is right. Your word is beyond anything else, and you've got to keep that. You've got to treat people decent. You can't rip them off. You've got to be so honest and so trustworthy and do everything that you say. And that's one thing that just drives me every day. Is like if I tell somebody I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. It's very That's the biggest thing, was the way he treated people. And sometimes it cost him money. There were deals where he said, I'll do it at this, and come to find out he could get another 50,000 from somebody else. But he said, no, I've already committed. I got to do it. He always told me, he's like, if you underprice a knife and the guy takes it and you go, oh, I made a mistake. He's like, no, you've already priced it. You've got to hold it. So it was all integrity. That was the biggest thing. It was just pure honesty and integrity, and treat people decent. So the business side of it is is do it above and beyond what anybody else does. Do if somebody else sends it regular mail, well, maybe send it FedEx overnight. You know, always go that little extra step, and don't worry about the nickel and dime stuff. You know, don't sweat the small stuff. The big picture, stay focused. You know, there's going to be some deals that aren't as smooth for you. There's going to be things in life that aren't smooth, but at the end of it, that's when it all comes back around.
Yeah, it's really really emotionally and an intelligent person to be able to see that. I mean, especially in those industries that you're talking about, there is lots of dishonesty and a lot of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, and to a certain extent, that's condoned, right? I mean, I've been in business for a long time, and that's kind of still the way it is. It's one big smoke and mirror. Um, but I'm interested. I mean, what do you feel like your legacy is going to be? Obviously, you're still active in collecting and distributing Loveless knives in the secondary market. Is that what you want to continue to do, or kind of what do you think like your next thing is?
That's funny because the next thing is always grouped into the same thing. It's basically collecting. I've got one of the largest collections of artists, and I'm as well known in the art world as I am in the knife world. And same way with the car world. I'm just as deeply connected into Ferrari as I am into Loveless as I am into paintings and artwork. So all three of those to me, they're the same thing. And if people remember anything from me, I hope it's just the education that they'll get from my writing the book on Loveless, because I said, you're not going to learn how to make a sheath, you're not going to learn how to grind a blade, but you're going to see great Loveless knives, what made them great, why they're different, why these are unusual. And that's basically what I want to be known for, is helping people build a collection so they don't go through the same missteps that we went through. You know, that paying your tuition is pretty painful. We did that in the art world. We lost our rear end. We did it in the knife world. We lost our rear end. You know, and I wish somebody had been there to say, "Hey, skip this step and go here." So that's what I really try to do. You know, particularly in the knives. I really want people to build. I'm more of a collector than I am a dealer. You know, I actually love the knives. I've still got Loveless knives that we bought back 40 years ago that I've never ever offered for sale. I mean, big bears that are hidden tang with maple and brass on them. I mean, beautiful stuff. And I love the thing so much. It's like, what would I do with the money? Because I like the knife. I buy it because I like it. I don't buy it because it's going to make money or it's going to go up. You know, if it goes up, great. If it doesn't, I really don't care. But I would just like to be known for helping people uh, build a collection, or at least become aware of what to look for, in knives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything I understand about you, that fits kind of like my perception of you. I think that even within the context of your collection and whatnot, I'm reminded. I got into looking at Sheffield era Bowie knives and the exhibition knives through, oddly enough, this old YouTube video that I can't remember when it was made. It was sometime probably in the 80s or maybe early 90s, and then through a series of book purchases and stuff, I really became a lot more aware of the the Sheffield and Solingen Bowie knives. It'd be really great to be able to have like some compendium or something where all of these knives, even some that nobody's seen before, are photographed, so that way, like in great detail, so that way you can uh, provide a visual element to for the rest of us and for posterity. I know that in the Georgia Knife Makers Guild, you've done some demonstrations and things like that, and that's always fascinated me too.
Yeah, with Loveless, it's just so natural for me to talk about Bob, because I can't sell anything if I don't believe in the product. I can't just say, hey, buy this just because. I had one guy ask me, the guy had just sold his business for $600 million. He called me up and he said, John, I'll give you $500,000 to build me a Loveless collection. I said, I can't do it. And he goes, why can't you? And I said, because you're only doing it because you want it as an investment and you've been told Loveless is the guy to buy, and you don't know why you want to drop 100. You don't know why you want a big bear. You certainly don't know why you want a New York special. You've got no idea about why you want this stuff. So I had rather sell to somebody that knows exactly why they want it. Just because you've got the money, doesn't mean you have the passion for it. So a lot of times the money, I know, especially in the art world, you can have the money, but Leo Castelli would not sell you that Jasper Johns. You had to be already in the system with him. So that's kind of that's kind of the way it is. I just really want people to be fascinated the same way I am.
Yeah, and I've never actually held a real Loveless before. It's one of those things that the access for a lot of knife makers just is not there. That's why I've kind of envied your demonstrations for the Georgia Guild, because that gives a an insight that it's just for most knife makers you just will never get.
Oh, it's unbelievable, and I love for knife makers to pick them up because, like I say, you see the bulb going off in their head. They're like, "Wow, wow, okay, feel the balance, feel where it does balance." Bob said, anywhere you squeeze that knife, he said, if you're working on a deer upside down in the river, it doesn't matter. That knife, if it's turned upside down and you're squeezing it, it's not going to leave any hot spots. Everything should be rounded, smooth. And Bob loved micarta. I think he would have built his house out of micarta. He said, if you drop stag, he said, you come back in 400 years and, your blades or your, your handle's gone. You come back in 2 years, your handle's gone. They said, if you got micarta, he said, you lose that knife 500 years later, you won't have a blade, but you'll still have a handle. So he really did not like using stag because stag had its own properties and it was hard to get the sculpting that Bob liked to fit the hand with. And when he found micarta, I mean, good golly, the feel and the balance he could get is just, it's absolutely spooky of how those things feel. I mean, somebody can lay down 100 knives and you can pick up a Loveless and tell that it's different from the other 99. It's that big a deal.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've often wondered, yeah, like the loss of phenolic resin in the United States because of all the carcinogens and whatnot, it's actually a lot more difficult to find really good micarta of the same ilk as what we call, vintage micarta that Bob was using every day. And so I think that that's also something that a lot of knife makers don't think about is the material choices of makers really had a lot to do with like look and feel, but a modern knife maker, it really has to pursue the same material, which are now vintage and a lot more rare and sometimes really expensive, in order to accomplish the same kinds of things, and just with workability. So there's all sorts of things that I think that the good old days are gone in some ways. The Bob experienced and had access to, and us knife makers now, yeah, we might be able to walk out with a really nice, well, fit and finished knife a little bit quicker. But there's just some things that you just will not get context into anymore because it's, those days are gone.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you look back at some of the old vintage guns or whatever. The materials have changed enough to where there is, it's like you look at the old houses built in the 1600s and they've got the really wide plank boards, and you're like, man, I'd give anything to have that sort of, you know, old growth tree that had that sort of width in it, and it's just not available now. And even stag, of all things, good grief, in the 70s, stag was just it was just stag, and it was pure amber stag. And now the stag you get has to be dyed, so they try to look like the old amber stag. But there's some things that we just because of civilization and the amount of material, it's just not available as as a product to be sold to people, the collectors. It's really hard. Same way with woods. They're starting to really crack down on certain woods that come out, and different things. But yeah, there's a lot of little pieces that are no longer available.
Yeah. Well, kind of on that note, people like you are rare as hen's teeth now, to be able to share firsthand accounts of, legendary makers and to, give perspective into the collecting world. I hope that people listening to this will be invigorated to, uh, to try their hand at collecting in a way that emulates the same kind of passion because I- you know I I think about it a lot, but the every old time knife maker that I've talked to, they're like all or most of my collectors are dead. They bought for a time, they supported me well, and now they're gone. Their kids sell off their collections or whatever, and it seems a little bit of a darker world without that same kind of history and passion and patronage that the collector has for the knife maker. And it's just there still in some ways, but it really does seem like the good old days were some fun times to be in. And uh, I hope that new collectors emerge and that we can collectively um, relearn that there's a symbiosis between the collector and the knife maker, and without each hand washing the other, that we're not going to have the same kind of thing that we did, back in the 50s to maybe the early 90s.
I agree. I think in the large part with all the makers that are out there now versus 1969 or 1970, it's like panning for gold. You've got to look through a lot of the other pieces, and that once you've separated everything out, you'll dig your way into the right knife makers. But there's so much out there right now. It's really you really have to look deep to try to go in to find any of those things. And I remember back in the '80s asking Bill Moran. I said, Bill, how many Damascus knives do you think you made? He said maybe 100. And I thought, wow, that's just hardly that's hardly any, and especially even back then, his Damascus was so expensive.
Yeah. Do you think that the proliferation or like the total volume that a knife maker makes has any bearing on on the collectability or the factor that you look for in a knife? Like did the number of knives that Loveless made have any bearing on you wanting to buy more of them?
Not particularly, not overall, because there were, like I said, there's a lot of great makers that made. Even now, there's some top makers that make 7 or 8 knives a year, and that's hard to create a secondary market. So you have to have enough product out there to have a secondary market. Otherwise you're sort of like Roll Hansen. You made a great product, but nobody knows who you are now. So there's not enough to create a secondary market demand. So if you're a very limited maker, if you're not careful, you can totally be forgotten. And that's the scary thing. I mean, D.E. Henry in the '70s, his Bowie knives were bringing $7,000-8,000, and Bob's fighter at that point was worth about 300. So D.E. Henry was massive. I mean, everybody has dreamed of D.E. Henry, and now those prices just you can't get anywhere near them. They're just he's been totally forgotten. Same way with Kronk. Good golly, Kronk used to sell for 7 or 8 times the price of a Loveless, and now you're lucky if anybody's even heard of the guy, much less wants to pay you big money for it. But those were the top makers. It's just like the Hudson River School painters, Bierstadt and Tom Moran, all those people in the 1800s. They would have people stand in line in New York City in 1890 when they would unveil these paintings. But by the time the 1920s came around, they were selling for like pennies on the dollar. So that is a massive market that just vanished. And now, of course, the prices are 2 or 3 million for a beer stat. The prices came back, so things can get lost. And if you live long enough, they can come back around. But most of us won't live to see that second burst of energy. But I do wonder in 100 years who will, who will they go back into the our period and go, okay, this is a great knife. Let's pick this out. You've got Loveless and Lake and some of these other people, and then is there going to be a resurgence for people we've totally forgotten about? I mean, will Royal Hansen or Wally Hayes become legendary? I don't know.
Yeah. Do you think at the end of Bob's life that he was starting to come to terms with his own fame and his own mortality? Like what did the later years of his life look like in your experience?
Yeah, he was a lot more kind, a lot more forgiving. A lot of the edge had come off of him. Um, as far as the fame, good golly, he was always quite aware of his power. And but the funny thing is also the fame doesn't give you confidence, and that was it's always so weird to me. Is when we would go out to San Diego in the '90s to the Art Knife Invitational, the AKI that Phil Lobred would put on. Bob would call us and say, I'm really worried that nobody's going to buy my knife, and what am I going to do if nobody buys them? And we'd say, Bob, don't worry, we'll buy everything you've got. Just go out there. But he really did have a fear of not being able to sell knives. He thought, you know, I'm well known, I'm famous, but then there's that insecurity that he had even with all that fame. So it wasn't something he felt really secure with. And I think toward the later part of his life, he realized, okay, I'm wearing down, I'm getting old, I'm getting sick, I can't produce. And Bob was never really a financial genius. I mean, he was like a 3-year old with money. You gave him $40,000, it would go into Rolex watches, Leica cameras, planes, cars. He just never had any money. So as far as a personal knife collection, he just didn't have anything set back, because his wife was so funny. I would go talk with her. We'd go out and see Bob. So I'd go see his wife and just to hear a different side. And she was just the nicest lady. And she could cook really great Southern food, which was so funny being Japanese. Bob loved his fried chicken. So she made some of the best fried chicken you've ever had in your life. And she said, he goes, Bob comes in here and comes into my collection of knives. He takes knife out. She goes, the knife never comes back. She said, I know he sells my knife. So Bob always would come in and she's like, once he took the knife, she's like, I never saw it again. Bob's like, I'm just going to borrow this knife, honey, take it out in the shop and show these boys. And she's like, I never saw the knife again. So he was always burning through money. And later on, he realized he didn't have, if he couldn't make knives, he couldn't make a living. And that happened, and that sort of was a realization that was hard for him to deal with because he's like, wow, I have to work to make money.
Yeah, I'm from some of our earlier conversations before we started recording and everything. You mentioned that uh, Bob's relationship with his wife was also completely different than what he had with everybody else. And I'd love for you to kind of like anecdote that a little bit because again, like you wouldn't hardly think that Bob was marryable in some ways, let alone had a wife and that she, they had a great relationship and they had daughters and everything like that. I'd love to kind of understand a little bit more about the dynamic between them.
Oh man, his wife was this beautiful Japanese lady, and just when Bob was around her, it was a whole different ball game. He was a kitty cat because she would tell him, she'd say, Bob, when you go out tonight with friends, do not yell. You yell at friends all the time. Don't yell, Bob. And she goes, also when we go to eat, put your teeth in, because Bob was always eating without his teeth in, and it was just so embarrassing to his wife. And she would say, Bob, you put teeth in, you act nice. She's like, you can't be mean to your friends. You're so mean. You're so mean to your friends. Why do you do that? Bob's like, yes, mama. Yes, mama. I understand. Yes, yes, yes. So and sometimes he'd come to the show and he'd go, well, I've already been, told what I need, how I need to act. So she could control him, but man, if you got him in a crowd of people, he was absolutely uncontrollable. I mean, he just got louder, he got more powerful, he got more boisterous, and then you pull him back to the side, and he'd calm down, and you could sort of halfway talk with him. But his wife was just, but I'm telling you, that Southern food she could cook was just amazing. Good golly, some of the best meals I've ever had have been uh, cooked by her.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Do you think that some of Bob's personality comes with his being abandoned by his father? I mean, it seems kind of like for those who have dad issues, that a lot of that confidence or a lot of that being loved and not feeling abandoned comes from early roots. And I mean, I've experienced that some inside of the dynamic of my own family, but I've always kind of had an inferiority complex, coming from a large family, absentee dad and things. It always felt to me like I needed to earn approval or to earn a seat at a person's table, and there wasn't really like the unconditional love, I guess, that like I showed to my kids. And I'm just wondering if maybe Bob showed that a little bit more than we'd like to think in his own behavior throughout the different periods of his life.
Yeah, I have no doubt that that was a huge traumatic experience. But when you're a kid, that's all you know. If you don't have if you're raised by your grandparents and your parents are not really around, he's got nothing else to judge it against. But you can see from his actions, he was very insecure, yet very much, bloated on his fame and fortune, but he was still very insecure on the inside, and he just didn't have, like you said, there was no unconditional love, and that's the reason I want somebody to do a story with his daughters. How was Bob like to his kids? Because it didn't sound like he was as a. I mean, when you run off to join the merchant marines at whatever 17 years old, I mean, you're obviously you're ready to get out and do something. So I just always wondered with his own kids how, what was he like? What did they learn from him? I think one is a lawyer, one is a guard at a prison somewhere in upstate New York, and another one still lives near Riverside, I think. But I've just talked to him on the phone, but I don't really. I've never met him, uh, but it's kind of interesting that they're out there and nobody really has said, "Hey, let's hear a story on Bob the human." If he is human, he may not be.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I rarely talk to people that I just cannot find something to like about. And I've talked to some real rough and tumble people. But I do wonder that, it's we have the ability with those who have passed to kind of get a 365-degree view of their personality if we have context. And I hope that somebody does pick that story up and is willing to talk to them, because we're going to approach a time where the context for Bob's history and how he was as a family man and things like that is lost to us, and we just won't have it again. So I think that that's something that somebody as a writer should focus on and get interviews with them and everything. And definitely, if somebody's listening to this and has the connections, talk to John Denton. He'll be able to facilitate it, and then give context into Bob, and then his daughters into Bob as the dad, right?
Yeah, I'd like, and because that, like I say, is a total unknown about his whole history. His knives from 1954 until the day he died, you can chart how he changed. How you can see a lot of that, but that's just shows up in his work. The personality of him as a human, as a father, as an everyday, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week person. We know nothing about what little I could get from his wife about how he would act. You could see that, but we don't know anything on the family side. I mean, nothing. It's just absolutely. It's like aliens dropped him.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. There's lots of food for thought in what you've brought in this conversation. I don't know. It'll take me a while to unpack it because I think that we are all just human at the end of the day. I'd like to know more about him that way too. But I think you've been able to help provide a little bit of a context, and it's a context through the juxtaposition of you and your father, right? You and your own father, and the kind of passion, the kind of integrity, the kind of business dealings that you guys had, and working with Bob and bringing his art to the rest of the world. I don't think that Bob Loveless would be a name that is synonymous with knives if it wasn't for John and J.W. Denton, and that's something that I think that you guys should be really proud of. And I know, I know in talking with you, it's something that really fascinates me.
Yeah, it's been a labor of love. Usually a hobby, you get tired of it. You buy a telescope, you look at the stars 2 or 3 days, and it sits in the closet for 20 years. But with Loveless, I never get bored because every knife is different. If somebody says, "Hey, John, I've got a drop point hunter," I can't wait to see it because I know Bob has probably changed something, done something. It could be a one off, something I've never seen. So I never, ever get bored with his knives. It's not like he had cookie cutter knives. You're like, oh, yeah, yeah, really? Okay. It's like, wow, let me see. One time he did an upside down gut hook. He made two gut hooks, but he made them upside down. Now, why did he do that? I don't know, but they're out there. So stuff like that is just. I'm still looking for stuff that has still not come out of the woodwork. Like those Loveless Johnson daggers. They were hidden for about 35 years, and they came to light a few years ago, and nobody had an idea there was any Loveless Johnson daggers ever created, and there's three of them.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Well, a life of collecting, a life of being able to rediscover things, and I hope that you continue to find things within the Loveless lexicon that continue to wow you.
Yeah, it's easy to talk about something that you really love, so it's no, there's no stress involved. It just comes out. It's very very easy.
It's given me a lot of food for thought, and sometime I'd like to be able to meet you and hold one of those Loveless knives and kind of get my own wheels turning on it because I think that's one of my goals is to be able to see knives from the old guard and really be able to tactically figure out how I personally want to do things as a maker. So hopefully we can sync up sometime and I can pick your brain in person.
Yeah, it would be great. I mean, I'm always at the Blade Show, and it would really help for you to actually hold one, see what you think about it. Like it or hate it, at least you're exposed to it, and that's the biggest thing is exposure for people. No matter what it is they do, let them see what they can get out. You and I watch a movie, we may think it's totally different. If we watch Citizen Kane, we may really love it. Somebody else sees it and they go, "That's the worst movie I've ever seen." Same way with Loveless. At least experience it, at least feel of it, feel what it's doing to your hand, and then you decide where you want to take it. So it's like a big cloud. It opens up in the sky. There's no limit at that point. You're like, okay, I can go forward at this point, and that's the exciting thing. Is there's still, like A.G. Russell said, there's still room for plenty of great makers in there. So it's not all done.
Yeah. Well, Blade Atlanta, you show up to, right? You do ever make it to the Blade Texas show?
I used to do Texas shows years ago, but I'm only down to about one show a year now. So Atlanta is really the only one I go to. But we used to go to Tokyo. We used to do all the stuff in L.A., Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Dallas, everywhere. But back then, that's the way you saw the knives. There was no email. There wasn't any way to do anything. So you had to actually go to the show to see the stuff. And so now it's just easier to sell it over the internet. Totally changed the marketing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we all kind of deal with the ease of use of the internet, but the lack of tactical experience. I'd tell anybody to pick up my knives and feel them and everything. That's what I want them to catch from the conversation. Is it's at the end of the day, it's a tool, and it should feel good to pick up and everything. Kind of picking up on the same concepts of Loveless. Like if it doesn't feel right, it's not right. And I think that's the same way I feel about relationships and everything too. It's like if it's right, it's right, and you know it. And that's kind of the thing. My knives are personal to me. I'm not making them try to make money. I'm making them because I want to put out a piece of myself for posterity. So it's I'll try to see if I can make it out to Atlanta next year, and if you're there, we'll try to sync up and maybe I can see some of your stuff.
Yeah, it'd be great. Or just come out to Hiawassee sometime. It's still a town of about 900 people up in rural Appalachia, so we got nothing but lakes and mountains and trout fishing.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the mountains in Pennsylvania. We're still Appalachian up there too. So I'll just have to drive from Texas over that way. My wife and I love road trips, so maybe we can make a trip out there sometime to see you.
That's right. Swing down to the northern part of Georgia.
Yeah, it's not too bad. We just got back from a 4,300 mile trip. I went up to Pennsylvania to show her around because it was the first time that she got to see
Wow.
where I came from, and then we went up to Boston and Salem, and then came back down. So we should. She
Wow.
hasn't been a lot over the Eastern Seaboard, so she got 9 or 10 states under her belt with that entire trip. So we
Wow.
really like driving.
That's a good trip right there. That's the way to do it. See a lot of stuff. Boston is an interesting place. Good golly. Yeah, there's a lot of neat places on the Eastern Seaboard. I mean, it's but of course, I like it out west. I like going to like Death Valley. I like monkeying around in the deserts, and it's just so different than what we have out on the East Coast. It's just. And Bob always said, Bob grew up and was born in Ohio, and he was always constantly talking about the old days. He's like, I want to come back to the East Coast. The people were friendly. It was a handshake. California is so wishy-washy, and you don't know who to trust. And he just had this memory, sort of what he thought back east was like. So he sort of just always was pining to come back east, even though he never would. But he was always like, man, I'd like to get back there.
Yeah, well, I was kind of the same way as a kid. I just thought out west was so as a rock hound, I just love the idea of being able to go out and pick up stones in the desert and see rattlesnakes and all that stuff. And living in Texas for half my life now, I could tell you it's hot. I love Texas. We're here for the long haul. We got kids and everything, but it is the difference in contrast. Like 90 degrees in Pennsylvania did not feel the same way as 90 degrees in Texas because of the heat index and lack of wind and everything. It was different. So my wife, seventh generation Texan, she really likes
Oh
the
gosh.
east, the northeast. So we have no problem
Wow.
making an excuse to go up that way.
Wow, 7 generations in Texas. That's true Texan right there.
Yeah. It's hard to compete with that. We're I mean,
Wow, wow.
I was many generations Pennsylvania, and I mean pretty much New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. That's where my family's from before they emigrated over from uh Germany mostly. But
Wow.
even still, Texas has a culture that it's really hard to appreciate if you don't have somebody telling you to appreciate it, which is the Texas way.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. If you're from Texas, it's a whole different ballgame. Where do you live in Texas?
We're in the DFW area, so
Oh,
yeah,
okay, okay.
northeast Texas.
So y'all get some cold, icy weather and some extreme heat then.
Yeah. The It's not winters are pretty mild. Almost never get snow. When we do, it's only
Wow.
for a few days usually. So it is not like being up north or dealing with anything on the eastern seaboard really. So
Yeah.
we'll continue to venture out that way a little bit more since my wife seems to like it so much. But the next trip is probably this fall, so that way she can see the fall colors because
Oh
being in
heck,
Texas, you don't really have fall.
no,
It turns brown and
no.
then everything dies off, and it's just cold and icy. But to actually appreciate the colors, that's kind of what she wants to see.
Wow, wow. Yeah, those color changes. I mean, it really is. I mean, you get up toward New England, it's just crazy, you know. And then comes winter. It's like wow. But during fall, it's like man, that's a place. Do you ever go down to Marfa in Texas? You ever been to Marfa?
We have never been. I'd like to be able to go down there. I just don't know what I'd do. There's a lot of the art scene and everything is pretty interesting down there, but
Yeah,
we haven't made the trip down yet.
I'd like to see it too. I'd like to see the Marfa lights. I just sort of like to see the layout. I don't know. I just kind of want to go there. You know, but it's a long ways from anybody, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty well. I mean, Marfa has its little microcosm of culture and lodging and stuff like that. But I know I worked with a guy that would go out there, and he did a lot of like avant-garde DJing, and so he'd do
Wow,
music production and stuff, and so he would go out there, I guess, and do acid and look at the stars and
dang,
things like that. So I mean,
neat, neat.
yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's on the list for sure.
Wow.
We sold our camper a few years ago, and I'm thinking about getting another one and just being able to go out and do some road trips. So that way, anywhere that we go, we don't necessarily have to spend thousands of dollars on hotel rooms. We can just stay in the camper that we pull behind and go and see the world.
Yeah, can you imagine? I mean, you just park it there for a while and explore and, look around. And do you ever see is there any fossils much in Texas or is that more toward like Montana and North Dakota?
It depends on where you're out at in Texas. In the DFW area, it actually sits in a sort of ancient lake bed or basin, right? And so
Wow.
there's all sorts of places that you can go for fossil hunting, like big ammonites. Sometimes you can find
Man,
like dinosaur feet. There's a place down as you go down a little bit further near Waco area, I believe. There's a place called Fossil Rim, and they actually have old dried up creek beds and stuff where you can see dinosaur footprints. And
oh,
so
yeah, I've seen photos of that. It's crazy.
yeah,
Wow.
it is pretty crazy, and all the
Mm,
limestone and white rock and everything has captured a lot. We used
mm,
to go out and go by the creek beds and see if we could find um, big ammonite and other ancient crustaceans and whatnot. So it's pretty cool, but it's very specific, like to that era
oh,
of lake bed and fossil structures and whatnot.
yeah.
I've never found any dinosaur fossils out while hounding, but it's pretty fascinating for where it's at.
Gosh, yeah, that stuff like that's always been. I wish I was as a kid. I always wanted to be like an archaeologist. Go to like you know the pyramids and just dig around for 6 years, sift stuff, and look for dinosaur bones. And even the big megalodon teeth. I'm excited about people when they find that in those rivers and stuff. I'm like, man, that's amazing.
Yeah, I've always been into like gold prospecting. Up in
Oh, neat.
Pennsylvania, the
Yeah.
only thing you can really find is natural silver deposits. But the gold rush and all of that was really cool to me. And I can't even imagine going out and like snorkeling to find megalodon teeth in
Wow.
the lower Appalachians and whatnot. To me, all that seems man, if I had time and money, I would just sit and do that kind of stuff. But if you're out sometime, you should go to Marfa. I mean, I've only heard really fascinating things about it, and you can, while you're in the area, you can go to Guadalupe Peak, which is the highest mountain location in Texas. I think it's like
Wow.
yeah, it's like 5,000 feet or something.
Geez,
Yeah,
I didn't know that was. Where would I fly into? Would I fly into El Paso, or where
yeah,
would I fly
yeah.
into?
I think that probably if you were trying to cut out some drive time, you'd probably fly into El Paso if you could, and just go around that area there.
Where's the Big Bend area from there?
I don't know. Let's look here. Big Bend. While I sit here on a recording and talk to you about this. Let me see if my map foo is it's not really too far away. If as I remember it, I mean, you got to think it's Texas, right? So, the Big Bend National Forest and area there is well, Big Bend National Park. Let's go there. So the Big Bend National Park is Alpine's probably closest. It's pretty far down on the Panhandle. I'm trying to think where you probably
Really?
yeah,
Wow.
fly into. Yeah, I don't. You could drive into San Antonio, and I think that that would be
Well,
probably the closest.
that's where my brother lives, is in San Antonio.
Yeah, it's pretty.
He loves it.
Yeah, it's pretty far from El Paso. I think that it's a little bit closer, maybe to San Antonio, but yeah, you could
Hmm.
hit it from you could hit it from Odessa if you can get into a Midland Odessa. If they have an airport
Yeah,
big
yeah.
enough, you could hit it from El Paso, and you can hit it from San Antonio. But uh, you're still looking at a pretty decent drive from
Boy,
San Antonio. Even I think it's probably like it is 7 hour drive from San Antonio.
wow,
So yeah, you know
wow,
that's kind
wow.
of one of the reasons why we've never actually gone down there is because from us it's I
Oh,
think it's an 11-hour drive. Yeah,
good
yeah,
golly.
it's
Yeah,
5.5 hours from El Paso, 7 hours and 13 minutes from San Antonio to go to Big Bend.
I mean, I can get to DC in 10 hours,
Oh yeah,
from
oh
Georgia.
yeah,
So that's a long
oh
drive.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when we were driving from
Gosh.
Texas, we spent 3 hours. I mean, we're in DFW, and we spent 3 hours driving to the border, and I might be able to get to Knoxville in 9 hours. So, but
Oh my
after that, when
gosh.
we were driving up through Pennsylvania, I'm like, you know what? Let's just do it. We could spend 6 hours driving, and we're going to be in 8 different states. It's more like being over in Europe, but Texas is so big. It's like forget about it. You're gonna take a half a day just to drive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just to try to get out of the state, you're gonna be in the car for a long time. Yeah, that'd get me
yeah.
deep
It's
down
a
into Florida. 10 hours.
Yeah, it is no joke. But yeah, it's 9 hours and 18 minutes from where we're at to get down to Big Bend.
Wow, boy, that's tough.
But yeah,
That's tough. That's not a.
if you yeah, that's a spend 2 weeks there if you're going to.
Yeah, really. When you get there, you don't want to turn around. You don't want to turn and burn real quick.
Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, so you could probably fly into El Paso, and Marfa, I think, is about an hour away from Big Bend. And it's before Big Bend, so you can hit that and then go down in that area. But I probably plan about a week and a half, just because you have a
Plus, I bet they've got really dark skies out there. You can really
oh
see the stars
oh
and
yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
probably.
very little light pollution. I mean, that's
Wow.
I think it would be good. I mean, if you're looking at something to spend a little bit of time at, and then it's really not that far over the border. Although questionable whether anybody wants to go to Mexico across the Texas border right now.
I
But
know. It's like, boy, don't want to get my head chopped off.
yeah, well, yeah, that is one of the things. But
Yeah,
yeah,
cartel's a little spooky.
yeah, yeah. I don't envy anybody that has to live down there and deal with
No,
that.
no,
But uh,
no.
yeah, but well, John, I'll
Yeah,
definitely try to
thanks.
make a point to see you. Getting to know you
Well,
more has been a
please do.
pleasure for sure. And I anytime you want to come on and talk about Loveless stuff, or if we get a little bit further on his daughters, being willing to talk about it. If nobody will do it in print, I'd be more than happy to have them as guests on the podcast and talk through that. And if you guys wanted to do that as kind of like a panel, that would be really cool too.
Yeah, that would be pretty neat right there. That would be something to think about to at least get it down, because I know nothing about that part of his
Yeah.
life. That's a big zero right
Yeah. Well, I'll
there.
tell you what, if you proctor that, you can be a co-host on the Good Old Blaze podcast where we actually break that open, and then hopefully that'll be covered in print too. I know some people, we could probably work it out where we can use podcast plus print and get the story out. So anytime you want
Yeah,
to, I am an open book on that.
yeah, we may try to do something with that just to get it down, because eventually somebody's going to want to publish it at some point.
Yeah.
But we need to get the story, to start with.
Absolutely. Well, that's what I'm all about. I mean, just trying to
Yeah.
record a certain aspect of history on audio. So, I appreciate your time and you investing so much of
Okay.
yourself in the community. And again, it's been a real honor.
Anytime, I appreciate it. Like I say, if you come to Georgia, come see me or whatever. But call me, Aaron, if you come up with any questions, or you know, I can even, if you want to make a knife, I can send you a Loveless. I can send you a real Loveless out there, and you can draw a pattern straight off of it or something.
Yeah,
So
I don't know if I'm that comfortable with it, but with post and holding stuff that I don't have the paycheck to reimburse you on. But I do appreciate the generosity for sure.
yeah, yeah. But I appreciate it. Thanks for all the hard work.
Yeah, well, thank you again. I really appreciate you. Thank you for spending your time with me on this episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are worthy, loved, and may God strengthen and bless you on your own journey in this crazy thing called life.